Hi there, thanks for tuning in tonight. My name is Emmett Byrne, and I'm the Design Director and Associate Curator of Design at the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis. The Insights Design Lecture Series is a 35-year partnership between the Walker and AIGA Minnesota, and it's an honor to be able to co-present a new lecture by Ruben Pater. Before we get started, I've got a few people that I need to thank. First, I'd like to mention our series sponsor, 10,000 Design. Thank you for helping us bring great design to the Twin Cities. And I'd also like to thank Shapko Printing, who donated the printing of this year's poster and has done so for many years now, so thank you both. Also, I want to let you know during this webcast, Ruben will be taking questions via the chat section in YouTube Live. So if you're watching this on the Walker site, we've provided a link below for you to hop over to YouTube to join the conversation. Ruben will also be on Twitter, so you can send your questions to #InsightsDesign or directly to him at unlisted_roots. So the first time I encountered Ruben's work was through his book, The Politics of Design, a not-so-global manual for visual communication, which proposes that every act of design, even the most mundane, is filled with individual agency. The form of the book is highly visual and is an example of his search for alternative ethical practices in the field, modeling a journalistic approach towards storytelling through the forms of graphic design. Before starting his own practice, Untold Stories, Ruben worked in Dutch design studios for 10 years, including Lava and Deetway, where he explored the overlap of design with business, advertising, culture, and government. Since 2012, he has taught at places such as the Design Academy Eindhoven, the Willem de Kooning Academy, the Royal Academy of Arts in The Hague, and at his alma mater, the Sandberg Institute. His work has been featured in over a dozen exhibitions around the globe and covered in publications such as Wired Magazine, Dezeen, and Novum Magazine, and he has received a variety of awards from places such as Ars Electronica, the European Design Awards, and the Best Dutch Book Designs. His next book, entitled Caps Lock, investigates graphic design's conflicted relationship with capitalism and will be published by Valise within the next year. So when I originally invited Ruben to speak at the Walker, he agreed on the condition that he would present his talk remotely in order to avoid contributing to the massive impact that global air travel has had on our climate. And now in our current moment, we're confronted with a completely different situation that happens to point towards a similar future, one in which globe hopping and travel-dependent practices need to be understood through new ethical criteria. As with every field, designers are frequently asking how their expertise might help them deal with these massive problems. And what Ruben does really well is illustrate that these issues aren't abstract challenges to tackle from afar, but actually embedded in every aspect of our daily lives. So, without further ado, Ruben Pater.
Take one, introduction.
Hi, my name is Ruben. Thanks, Emmett, for this introduction. Actually, I'm not in Minneapolis myself. I'm here in my studio in Amsterdam, recording this remotely. So actually, the original idea behind this was that when I was asked for the Walker Insights lecture, is that I don't fly anymore because of the climate crisis. One return tickets from Minneapolis to Amsterdam would amount to 3 tons in CO2, which is 3 times the allocated budget per citizen of the world if we want to keep the world sustainable. And also I thought it was a kind of an idea to challenge this, nomadic lifestyle of the designer traveling all around the world, doing presentations. Is that sustainable? And also, it's also kind of privileged because not everybody has the passport or the health or the abilities to travel around the world. So can we come up with new ways of presentation, sharing knowledge from a distance? And it was really nice that Emmett and the team at Walker was really interested in exploring this with me and looking for new ways of doing this. But this was 2 months ago, and now we're faced with this terrible pandemic. In a kind of dark irony, this idea of remote presenting and also remote communication has actually become a necessity today. People being quarantined, having to teach from a distance. So I was wondering whether or not I should do this presentation, but I still think it can be relevant because I will discuss ideas of remoteness and also how we as designers relate to things like distance, so that we communicate to people that live far away from different cultures, but also how does it work when we outsource printing, when we work for clients in different countries. So I think all these things come together in the presentation I will share with you today. And so for me, the first thing was, if you don't fly anymore, and this was last winter, how do you go on holiday? And I actually decided to hitch a ride on a container ship. So here you see actually the view from my cabin at the container ship. So the ship is called the MV Christopher. You see it's kind of like an average size container ship. And it goes from Hamburg to St. Petersburg and back. So this is in 2 weeks. And I was asking people, hey, if you want to follow me, you can go to Vessel Finder or vesseltracker.com. You can actually follow the ship's movements, and there's this website. And when you look up ships, you will see the amount of ships being en route at any moment in time. And there's an astounding kind of scale to this industry, especially because 90% of the world's trade is done via shipping. So coming into Hamburg Harbor, the kind of size of this logistics, how it's possible that supermarkets are stocked every day, and I think these things are actually playing out right now in the situation as well, that we see that we need these kind of mega structures larger than life. The machines that transport these containers are literally kind of transformer machines. And on the ship itself, these are some of the containers. There was no idea to find out what was in the containers as well. So we know that shipping is very cheap, but yeah, some of the containers were empty, and some could have had really valuable materials. There was no way to find out. But it was interesting because speaking to some of the crew, and most of the crew were actually Filipino, we realized that they were actually not being paid minimum wage. So this was a German ship, and they were not paying German minimum wage. And also another thing is that they were really scared of piracy. So they were really happy to be deployed actually in the Baltic Sea, because there's no pirates there in opposition to things like Southeast Asia and the Gulf of Aden near Somalia, for example. So when you think about how cheap things can get, if you can actually ship a kilo of coffee for 10 cents, and it's actually regarded to be efficient to design a book in the Netherlands, print it in China, and then sell it in the United States. It's considered more efficient than printing and producing locally. So I think this is very interesting, is that why is shipping so cheap? And so the project I want to talk to you about is the project I did for my MA graduation project in 2012 for the Sontag Institute in Amsterdam, which talks about this international shipping industry. And what I've learned is that there is no such thing as free shipping. Because the boat that I was on, the container ship, the Christopher, was a German ship owned by a German company, but actually had the flag of Antigua Barbuda. So I didn't know this country existed. I had to look it up. It's an island nation in the Caribbean. And it's a very small nation, and it actually kind of looks like this. And it looks very different than the sea I was actually at that moment at, which is a very cold sea between Russia and Germany. So why can a ship from Germany actually have the flag of this Caribbean island nation? And this is something called flags of convenience. And that's kind of the idea that for people it's very difficult to change nationality. You have to live somewhere for a really long time. You have to spend a lot of money. But for ships this is very easy. You go to a website, you download a form, you pay a little bit of money, and within hours you can actually change flags. So why do ships do that? Well, first of all, labor and environmental regulations, for example, in Antigua Barbuda or Panama or Liberia, are very different than in Germany or the Netherlands. So it probably has to do with trying to cut costs, paying your crew less money, and also dodging environmental regulations, but also taxes. A lot of these so-called cheap flags, for example, Panama and Liberia have the largest shipping fleet in the world, while they're actually really small states. You also sometimes don't even have to pay any taxes at all on your ship. So this is the only way this international industry can actually stay competitive. So this project that I did in 2012 started actually with piracy in Somalia, because that was in the news at the time. And I learned that one of the reasons for this kind of pirates being active there was that in the 1990s, there was a period when Somalia basically had no functioning government. There was no Coast Guard or anything. So fishermen in Somalia were faced actually with fishing trawlers from Europe, completely emptying out their seas, particularly fishing for yellowfin tuna. So fishermen got very angry, and in addition, criminal organizations were actually dumping toxic waste. So here you see toxic waste actually coming up on the shores of Somalia. So how did the international community respond? Because this is also my interest. I'm not from Somalia. I know very little about this country, but I'm from the Netherlands, and we have the biggest port in Europe. And there was a lot of complaints that this was dangerous and even harmful for the Dutch economy and for the port of Rotterdam. So the Dutch government decided to send marine ships to this area and even put marines on ships themselves. And that really made me think of this West and East India corporations run by Holland in the colonial times, when actually military personnel were actually placed on commercial vessels, right? So this idea that nationality and military and trade actually goes hand in hand. So here you see, for example, Dutch Marines boarding the vessel Taipan to free it from Somali pirates. So what I found out when I did this research, because I started to not look at the pirates themselves and piracy, which is a very complicated and of course violent issue, but something that I could know something about, which is where are these ships coming from? Some of these ships were from Holland, from Germany. So what's going on? And then I found out that most of the ships that were actually seajacked by Somali pirates, I compiled a list, actually didn't fly the flag of where the shipping owner was actually located. So German ships would carry flags of Antigua Barbuda, Greek ships would carry Panamese flags, Dutch ships would carry the flag of Liberia. And then I realized that this flags of convenience was actually a really strange relationship, because at one hand you have protecting national trade, protecting the Dutch national trade, but then the ships, they don't care about the nationality because they use any flag they want basically to make more profit. So what I started to do is to look at the flags and also to realize, hey, maybe, because a flag is usually something, if you drop it on the floor or if you damage it, it's a political act, right? So I decided, you see behind me, I started to buy flags and cut them up and then put them together in a way where you see the kind of the country of the owner of the ship actually seeping through the flag that was actually flying. Also this idea, because most of the ships that were seajacked were oil tankers, because they are the most valuable vessels to actually seajack. So here you see some of these flags. So I made a series of 30 flags, and I compiled them in an installation where you could see all the flags, but also in this book, what you see here. So this book is also bound as a flag, and every page is basically a ship. And you see the flag of the ship that I created, but also on the back you see the cargo of the ship when it was seajacked, but also kind of more gossip news. So about the shipping families sending their children to Hollywood, but also instances of illegal fishing, Actually, I found many different things that were actually illegal, like some aspects that were pointing to terrorism, that were pointing to weapons trade. So then you realize that this kind of shipping that is defended by national navies everywhere is actually a kind of mesh of tax evasion, illegal activities, everything to keep this kind of industry competitive. So this project was called Flags Convenience, precisely because of the two flags that kind of come together in this narrative about global capitalism and what is actually needed to kind of function. And to also question this whole idea of pirates bad and shipping is good, trade is good, and interfering with trade is bad. And to kind of more think about this relationship of global logistics. And what I think is really important is that when we think about these ideas of kind of global, often there's this idea of it's a new world. We have a free flow of goods throughout the world. We have a free flow of capital throughout the world, but then again we have more and more border walls. So what is actually considers this global village, right? So trade has to be completely free. Then again, there's all these trade blocks as well. And I think what's interesting is when you see this kind of idea of global, it actually comes down to the fact that there are ideas, usually from the global north, often from Europe or North America, that are actually implemented everywhere in the world. And that actually brings me to my second project, which is a book I wrote in 2016, The Politics of Design. So this is the book. So it's a small book. That was the idea, to produce it cheaply and to fit in your pocket. So this is my first book. I had no aspirations actually of writing a book, but what it was, I was actually working for graphic design companies, and I realized that there's a kind of naivety in the graphic design community when we're working for clients, you know, from far away, in different languages, for different ethnicities, for different groups of people, that are kind of often not really, you know, researched, but we kind of wing it, and we kind of have the idea that because we know graphic design, the languages that we know will work everywhere, right? After all, it's a global village, etc. But actually found that a lot of times, and I found myself guilty to this as well, that we were creating materials that were actually insensitive to certain people, or that were we didn't really understand, we were making mistakes. And it's actually quite normal today to work for you know, a client across the world, and to kind of assume that, you know, if you understand graphic design and if you have been taught that, then it can pretty much be understood everywhere. And I think I really realized that that is actually a false assumption, and that we have to also really not assume anymore that graphic design can be neutral or objective, because this was actually long assumed. So what did I do with this book? So ideas about kind of different cultures and how cultural bias works, for example, in visual communication, is not new. It has been discussed since the 1960s and 70s in anthropology, in sociology, in philosophy and cultural studies. But I found that a lot of these books are not being read at design schools. You know, at design schools you learn how to make design, good concepts, good form, but you rarely learn exactly what it means, what the designs that you create actually mean in society. So I tried at least to translate some of that academic material for a really broad group of graphic designers, visual communications, specialists, etc., especially using visual examples, because you can say all design is political, and this is also the kind of the premise of this book, but it's more important also to show it than how is all design political. And I think this also goes into the idea of, you know, can we design something for a place that is far away? You know, like I'm doing this presentation remotely, and that we're kind of used to working remotely, but how smart is that, and what are the pitfalls in this kind of processes? So the first example I want to show you is by Richard Dreyfuss. It's an American designer from 1959. He made this book called The Measurements of Man, which is where this image is from. So he was an industrial designer, an architect, and he was really important in kind of using the measurements of the human body in everyday design of spaces, architecture and furniture, which is of course very important. But at the moment you present this kind of standards, in this case the body of a man and a woman, you also realize that standards can be also quite exclusive, but also even violent. So in this case, for example, it assumes that gender is always a binary choice between a man and a woman. While of course there's many other ways of interpreting gender. So already to position that as this is the only choice is already I think a very, you know, culturally charged statement. Secondly, where do these measurements come from? So the measurements of the men, for example, come from US military men being measured for military service. So we're not just talking about, you know, the average person in the world. No, we're talking about young military-age males from a certain country and a certain culture. And of course, this set, although this book is still being used in design schools, it has been expanded upon, but we still should always be aware that when we use standards as designers, and we need standards in order to work, that we do challenge them, and we understand that they always exclude as well. So this is an example from 1974, also from the United States, commissioned by AIGA, a set of icons for the US Department of Transportation, which was later adopted by ISO. So actually, personally, I love this set of icons. It's designed really elegantly. But as Abbott Miller and Alan Lupton have pointed out, that also this series has actually a lot of cultural biases in it. For example, the icon for a ticket office is a man buying a ticket from a woman. And the icon for a restaurant is a knife and a fork, which is a Western eating utensil. This is not, in every country the standard eating utensil. And the word parking is, of course, an English word with a Latin alphabet. So it already assumes a kind of cultural perspective at the moment that you see these icons. And sometimes we don't even realize our biases until we see them kind of grouped together, as this one about race, for example. And I think designers and many other people in visual communication also have the role of representing certain groups in society. For example, if you look at how diversity is often portrayed at companies, for example, here at Northrop Grumman, you see this kind of, photo like they were picked from a spreadsheet, basically. And then you reverse search the same image, and you find that these people, of course, don't actually work there, but they're actually, of course, a stock photo, used by all these different companies to portray the image of diversity. So we really have to watch out that as designers and people that work in visual communication, our skills are not being abused by portraying a kind of organization in a different way than what's actually going on inside. Because if you look at the CEOs and the board of directors of these companies, there's a whole different image of diversity that appears there. So representation can also be used as a kind of weapon. So we really have to, be critical of ourselves and our own work in this. So maps is a very obvious example of, I think, how politics become tangible in design, loosely categorizing cartography also as a form of graphic design. So here you see a map of the British Empire from the 1800s, adorned with this kind of colonial motifs. But the map itself, the projection, is the Mercator Projection, which is a map from 1569 by a Belgian cartographer, Gerardus Mercator. So here you see the map again. And what's interesting about this map, first of all, it was made in colonial times, and it was made in Belgium, which is in Europe. So Europe is in the center of the map, first of all, because that is where the people who drew the map were living at the time. But also it's made for compass directions used for ships in colonial times. So the compass directions are made from the perspective of Europe, which is why the southern hemisphere actually looks way too small. So there's a distortion going on in terms of size that has been often criticized because this map is actually very popular. You can see it a lot. But if you look closely at the sizes, so Australia looks smaller here than Greenland, but it's actually 3.5 times bigger than Greenland. So this map has actually been criticized to be colonialist because it portrays the to-be colonized continents much smaller than Europe, where the colonizers are coming from. And it was actually criticized in 1973 by Arnold Peters, who was a German cartographer, who actually drew this map as a response, which is actually an equal size map. And it looks completely different. So you also realize that just a way to use a different proportion of the way that a sphere is actually put on a flat plane, so the projection of the map, has already such a different political message. And I think I also try to use a lot of examples in this book, how designers actually take this idea of cultural bias and everything is politically charged, but actually use that to their advantage. And I think this map by Buckminster Fuller from the 1950s is really interesting, the Dymaxion map, because it's a map that actually the user can fold any way they want. So it doesn't promise to have a central point. It leaves that up to the viewer. And it's also, I think, nice that there's a kind of like one island Earth, as Buckminster Fuller called it, because all the continents are kind of connected together. This is a map from China. I think just repositioning the center of the map, like me being from Europe, this map gives a completely different idea of world order and even political power compared to the maps that I am used to seeing, which often have Europe in the center of the map. So I think it's also interesting to understand that every map also offers a very small perspective on the world. So there's another example that I want to show, because this is what I also use very much in education, is that we often assume that design education is something that is often related to European design culture or North American design culture, while there are many design cultures in the world. A lot of them neglected or even unknown. So this is a map from the Inuit from Greenland from the 1800s. And what I like about this map is that it shows that there's completely different ideas of thinking about cartography, because this is also a map. So this is actually the coastline of East Greenland. And I think this map has at least two very interesting design components. First of all, you can feel it. It's a tactile map. So if you have no light, for example, in the polar night, you can still use it. And also it's made out of wood, so it can actually get wet and still function. So a paper map in the same circumstances wouldn't do as good. So I think it's also important to understand that many of the design histories that at least I have been taught are very much informed by design histories from Europe and North America, but that's not necessarily, there are many kinds of design histories that can be told all over the world. And sometimes the way that designers kind of shape ideology or shape the way that we look at the world, it becomes very obvious, like this, this difference between a boys and a girls magazine, where you see that, just using different words and different images, it completely changes the kind of construction of gender, which we know happens at a very young age. It's very much informed by things like advertising and, the visual world around us. So I think we have a responsibility to really think about what kind of world are we showing people, and how do we kind of also shape that world using visual communication. So this is also how companies and governments relate to that. So this is an example of the IKEA catalog. So the left is from Sweden and the right is from Saudi Arabia. This version of the catalog, IKEA photoshopped all the women out of the version. And people only found out online when they kind of changed languages. And then after the fact, IKEA apologized for it, but of course, they were catering to as many markets as possible, changing their kind of ethics as they go. So I think it's also important to understand how ethics are also sometimes very locally oriented, and companies are willing to give up ethics that are used in one country for the purpose of profiting in another one. But we should also understand that ideas of censorship and this kind of gender norms are not merely beholden to Middle East. This is an example for Utah of a yearbook photo where the photo of a student was actually adapted to be more suitable for a yearbook in this case. So there's many types of censorship and many types of how gender norms are enforced this way. So with technology now becoming such a most important carrier of information, it's often argued that because it's using technology and it's using artificial intelligence and machine vision and all these things, this is actually going to get rid of all human bias, because of course it's just a numbers game. But what we have seen, and this is an example from Hewlett Packard, and this is another one from Nikon, is that technology inhibits as much cultural bias as previous communication channels actually did. And that's because the engineers who work on these programs and who write this code are as human as we all are. They have human biases, but also the data that these things, in this case face recognition algorithms, are trained on are also often have an historic bias. For example, the New York Times showed that most of the face recognition software is trained on mostly male Caucasians. So I think it's really important to be critical of the way that technology performs cultural bias and ideology, much of the same way as the maps did from the 1560s. So in my book, I actually give a lot of examples of designers who are actually not afraid to use that agency, that they know that everything has cultural biases and nothing is neutral, to their advantage. Because a lot of people come to me and they say, but all these things you write about in your book, what can we do? We cannot be creative anymore because there are so many limitations, because we could be wrong. You can be wrong. It's also good to know that you could be wrong and to also acknowledge that. But I don't think it has to necessarily limit creativity, because at the moment that you know that everything you make actually has a political impact, then you can also choose to either serve or subvert the status quo. So I think it's actually a really great way of using design as a way to shape the society for the better. For example, so one of the artists that I actually show in my book is Harvey. So this project, CV Dazzle, what's really interesting is that he's looking at how Facebook puts face recognition on photos that people upload automatically. And you know, some people don't want that, but Facebook automatically does that. And then he actually, what he did is not make a whole kind of military security thing against that, a kind of protest, but actually see it as a form of fashion. So he created a line of makeup and a series of hairstyles that prevent Facebook face recognition algorithms to recognize your face. And I think this is a really great example of how artists and designers are always trying to figure out ways to kind of subvert the system. I think that's one of the points also I want to show with my book, is I think this is a kind of area in design that we can be much more active in. So after this book, I think it would be interesting to talk a little bit more about technology and what it means in society in general. So we're discussing technology, right? And I think with this face recognition technology, it's very clear that we are using more and more of these kind of technologies to make our society more secure. Whether it is in airplanes where you have to go to this kind of body scanner, leaving your shampoo and your water bottles all behind, and the machine kind of says if you're allowed in the airport or not, right? Just as face recognition is kind of used as a way to kind of select, hey, you are a threat or you are not a threat. So this way, I think technology is more and more used as a way of mediating between people, especially those who we don't want close to us or we don't want to engage with, and those that we do. And I think it's very important because, you know, technology is also used, and the way it's used sometimes in design as well, is that there's a kind of power relation, right? Just as, not unlike I'm actually, you know, doing this presentation, but you're not allowed to interrupt me or to ask questions during the presentation. So this is not a very symmetrical relationship, as it were. So in this kind of asymmetry and technology, I think is really clear in drone warfare, because you have on one hand a drone operator and a drone pilot who are half a world away from the actual aircraft that can be, you know, either doing surveillance or actually, you know, shooting missiles on the other side of the world. But the pilot and the drone operator don't actually put their body in a vulnerable position. So the countries that have access to this technology and have the resources to deploy it, they have the choice, you know, not to engage themselves, but other people that don't have those resources are subjected to this technology. So this is why I made the work, the Drone Survival Guide, which you see behind me. This is a work from 2012. So I finished my Sandberg master. And after that, I was thinking about how do I want to continue with my practice. And when I was working as a designer, of course, clients came to me and they, you know, brought the topics and the products that they wanted me to promote. But often I thought, yeah, but there's also a lot of topics that I find important for the larger society, but nobody ever asked me to work on that. So my kind of idea was, can I work in this area of journalism and design and work on topics that are maybe beneficial to a large part of society and are not addressed by anybody else. So the first thing I made was this project, and the Drone Survival Guide is a kind of a discussion piece that wants to discuss, do we want these kind of weapons in our society? You know, what is the future of robotic warfare in relation to things like inequality and, you know, the world politics today? So you see behind me a big version, but this is actually the version that is actually produced the most. So the Drone Survival Guide is basically a document that shows all the most used military drones by scale. So it's a kind of bird watching of the 21st century where you can recognize the silhouette of a drone by using this guide. Of course, on the back, and there's ways of hiding from drones and hacking drones and other ways to subvert its sensors. Now, this document will actually not keep you safe. That's also not the intention. It's meant as a discussion piece. And also to kind of think about how do we talk about these kind of issues. And that's also why the document is in 2 languages. So here you see one that's in Arabic and English. Because I think it's also important to have different ways of entry into the project, so that it's not just for people who only speak English. And I think it also emphasizes this asymmetry of the warfare itself. There's always a receiving end and a sending end of this kind of violence. So you see the paper is mirrored. This was the idea that for me the mirror is a kind of metaphor for surveillance. So first of all, of course, surveillance using cameras is a way of people looking at people. We're basically looking at ourselves. But also that in Greek mythology, Medusa, whose gaze could turn people into stone, was actually defeated using a mirror by Perseus. So it's not just this poster. Actually, what's for me really important is that my work is accessible freely. So there's a website where you can actually download all the guides for free. But if you want to support the project, you can actually buy the physical version of the guide. So there's also a version in Japanese and Chinese, there's a version in Hebrew and Arabic and etc. So a lot of people have volunteered to make new translations, and in return they get a free copy. So the fact that this project got actually quite a lot of attention, also because the topic in itself at that moment got a lot of attention, I managed to continue this project. I was approached by a composer from London, Gonzalo Cardoso, who really wanted to work with me on a kind of sonic aspect of this project, which is actually very logical because you can see the kind of bird watching metaphor also is of course asks for a kind of bird sounds catalog.
Predator MQ1.
And it was not just about collecting the sounds of these drones, because these drones are more often heard than seen. They often fly above the clouds or so high that you cannot see them. But also that we were reading all these reports from conflict areas like Gaza and like Waziristan, the border region between Pakistan and Afghanistan, where people are continuously subjected to this sound for hours on end. And it was really terrorizing. It was creating a post-traumatic stress syndrome for people. So it was also important to realize, and this is also why we did this project, is that it's not just about the sound of drones itself, is that the sound in itself is a form of terrorism and a form of terror and a form of violence. Especially because, you know, somebody living under drones, you never know when these drones will strike. So this is kind of a little bit, this kind of scope of projects that work with this idea of remoteness and technology. But then I was also interested in, you know, thinking about more local ways of working and actually bringing that remoteness back into local circumstances that you know and that you understand. So the next project I want to talk about is a much more local project. So in 2017 I was asked by the artist Berger to join his research about people living in trailer parks in the Netherlands. We call them campings. Because in the Netherlands we actually have the most campings in the world per capita. And the reason why is because in the 1950s and 60s all the Dutch families that would go on holiday would go to these kind of camping places. Really wonderful places where you could bring your children. But of course now flights to Spain and Italy are really cheap, so these campings have completely emptied out in the last decades. And that actually brings in another topic, which is the housing scarcity in the Netherlands. So there's such a shortage of low-income housing that a lot of people have no place to go, especially after a divorce or when they cannot pay their mortgage or they, for whatever reason, end up on the streets in an unexpected situation. It's almost impossible to get a house. And the campings are kind of the last resort then, because there's all of these empty places where then people will live. Usually the idea is temporarily, but often it ends up being many years. But the point is, it's illegal to live on campings in the Netherlands. So on the one hand, police and governments are kind of allowing it, but can also change their mind anytime and then give really high fines. So Klaas invited me to become a researcher in this project, and for this reason we actually spent 3 months going to 7 of these campings, talking to people living on campings, camping owners, social workers, police, municipality, migrant workers, so all these different groups that are present or in some way related to these places. And the first thing that we found out is that this image in the Dutch media is really much about campings are these crime-infested areas that are really dangerous, and people that are looking for places to escape the law all go there. So this was really like the central kind of story in the media, was so far from the truth, because on these campings we met all these different people that for whatever reason couldn't find a house anymore and had no other option than to go there. But also what was really interesting is that, so as graphic designers we're kind of used to, we get information from the client, or we find news articles, or we're looking for all this information. But it's completely another thing to get knowledge, to get information from people themselves, just by talking to people and just to understand that local politics and the everyday way politics works is super messy. And that maybe certain policies that were actually meant to work in a certain way completely work in a different way. So I think it was really, for me, a really helpful experience to understand how can you get information from a project, not from books, not from briefings, but actually from people themselves. So how actually as a designer do I fit into this, right? Because we did all this research. So I was kind of looking for a language to discuss this issue, because we found it was much more about the campings. It was actually about Dutch bureaucracy pushing people to the fringes of society. Dutch bureaucracy is very neatly organized, which is why the project is called Camping Kafka. So the project ended up being a kind of mapping of Dutch bureaucracy and how all these different groups, whether they're single mothers, whether they're freelancers who lose their income, or elderly people looking to leave the city, how these people all end up on these campsites. But usually when things like poverty and housing scarcity is being discussed, there's this kind of idea to present kind of photography as a medium to represent this. So, looking, you show people that need your help. They look poor. You have to give money, or you have to support the cause. So this kind of socialist imagery that's supposed to, make people feel empathetic when they look at it. But during this project, we were continuously showing all our sketches and ideas to all the people involved. And a lot of people at the campsite said, yeah, we don't want to be victimized. We don't want to be shown as being passive and helpless, and like we are waiting for help, because we are not. We want to feel empowered. So rather than using photography, which would really also bring down the whole narrative into kind of one particular phase or one particular situation, when there were so many different groups living on campsites, we decided to actually create a series of emojis. Because we wanted visual ways to kind of engage with the different people on campings, finding a visual language to discuss with them and to also organize the process. But the problem was that there were no emojis for homelessness, there were no emojis for single mothers, migrant workers, and for poverty. There's a lot of emojis of stuff you can buy and food you can eat, but not so much about poverty. So I decided to make a new series of emojis, especially for this project. A migrant worker, somebody who's homeless, somebody who's broke, a single mother, and a policeman who's allowing people illegally to live at campings because he's empathetic to the situation. This is a very Dutch phenomenon. So actually it was only intended, these emojis were only intended as a kind of language to work during the project. But in the end, what came out of the project? So I was really interested in saying, let's make a whole campaign. We have all this information. We now understand how this Dutch bureaucracy is operating. Let's make a really big campaign to push Dutch politics to change. And then Klaas said, rightly so, so if we do a campaign, we put a lot of money and a lot of effort into getting a lot of attention. So you get a lot of attention, and then weeks or months later, this is gone. And then 5 years later, somebody else is doing a project on poverty and housing scarcity. So how, instead of thinking about short-term effect, how do we kind of build foundations for other people to work on, and how can we actually change something? Because the people who actually take the decisions are not the larger public here, they're the local municipalities. And the best way of engaging with those is just meeting with those local municipalities. So what we actually end up doing is actually not designing at all, but creating a kind of place, in this case a kind of installation, with these kind of images, but also a water slide. It can also be fun, it's recreation, where different groups could actually meet and discuss alternatives for this issue, Because we found that when we were talking with all these different actors, they never talked with each other, but only about each other. So for us, this was a way of bringing together social workers, migrant workers, but also people living on campsites, people being in debt, but also people from the local municipalities to discuss this issue and think about alternatives. And currently, this project is actually not more than that. A few years later, this is just going from municipality to municipality to organize discussions, informing actually local lawmakers about different perspectives when it comes to these campings. So this idea of how messy local politics can get and how messy politics in itself is, and really brought me also to think more broadly about the language of politics and the visual language of politics. So I was just talking about how different kind of politics are different on a local level when you actually talk to people than how they are, from a newspaper perspective, looking at laws and looking at parliamentary politics and party politics, etc. And I think this kind of gap between how people experience politics and how politics are being performed, let's say, in the House of Representatives, I think for me is very interesting because a lot of people have been talking about, crisis in democracy. A lot of parties who are kind of being, challenging the economic system, the political system, have been very successful. And a lot of people kind of say that they lost their faith in politics. For example, in the Netherlands, 1/3 of youth does not vote, so between 18 and 24. And 75% of the Dutch youth has no faith in politicians. And but on the other hand, you see a lot of protest in the streets. You see climate marches. There's a lot of different protests now happening in Holland all the time. But also a lot of these, you see people actually under 18 participating in the protests, particularly in the climate marches. Because people that are 16 might have really strong political ideas, but they're not eligible to vote yet. And demands to actually lower the voting age to 16 has been denied in the Netherlands. But it's also the future of these young people that we're talking about here. So in the Netherlands, the idea of politics is still kind of regarded as something like you vote every 4 years. Every 4 years there's like a campaign with posters. And there's like a debates on national television. You listen to the party leaders and then you vote. And then, they will take care of everything else. So the participation in politics is really kind of limited in the way it's been discussed in society. And that is often also kind of placed outside of, the personal practice of politics. Like how do you think about society? How do you deal with your colleagues, with your friends and with your relatives, right? So I was really interested in, after the last election in the Netherlands, really interested in, can we think about new ways of visualizing politics, but also representing politics and the language of politics itself. Because I'm not necessarily a big fan of redesigning the democratic process in a sense of like, it needs to happen via an app or via a different website and then everything will be fine. I think there's a legitimate worry that people are not being listened to, and a lot of people really say that they don't really feel that politicians care really about what they have to say. So in order to kind of find more out about that, I started to interview Dutch youth between 14 and 27 during the last 2 years. And I worked together with a big team of young filmmakers, designers, animators, interviewers, to kind of find out, what are young people in the Netherlands thinking about politics? They're the ones creating the future. They're the ones who are going to be running this country. So first of all, what was really interesting is that almost all of them said, I don't care about politics. A lot of my friends don't vote, and even if they did, they said, I don't even know the difference between left and right wing. Sometimes I hear it via my grandma. It doesn't really come across in my timeline. These are some of the things that we heard. And then we started to ask more about, okay, so you're not interested in politics, so what do you care about? And then it turned out, actually, all of them had really well-informed opinions and stories about their everyday life, about things like gender equality, things like racism, the climate, healthcare, education, all these things. All from their own perspective or from knowledge from their family, really well informed. So we realized this is a really big problem because this is also politics, but people are not really seeing it like that. So I think what we kind of started to recognize is there's a kind of gap between how politics is kind of, how we talk about politics in the media and how politicians talk about politics, like let us handle it and you just vote for us, versus the public who feels that their voice is neglected, and they actually have a lot of knowledge, just like the people at the camping have knowledge for lawmakers. Everybody has their own form of knowledge that we can kind of do something with. So in this project, actually, we started to do these interviews. And actually, one of the things that came out is that maybe the idea of politics should be broadened. Maybe everything is political. You know, maybe we should think about different moments in somebody's life that you can be political, not just every 4 years, but in your neighborhood, you know, with your family, with your friends, with everybody. So all of the material from these interviews now is being compiled into a series. So it's going to be a series that's going to be broadcasted on Instagram and other social media. The form in which this kind of language that is part of the experiment, how to develop new languages to talk about politics, was also done in collaboration with the same youth that we have been interviewing. So now I'll show you a preview because we have been talking about climate change and also the effects of climate change and this idea of not flying anymore. But let's listen to young people and what they have to say.
Vertel Emma, wat ben je aan het doen?
Ik ben even bezig met mijn bord. Dit is poging 3 van het bord. We gaan het niet hebben over de eerdere pogingen, want het is een beetje gênant. Nou, we zijn nu onderweg naar Den Haag. We zitten in een overvolle trein, zoals je kan horen. Er zitten superveel jongeren met borden in. We hebben ook al gehoord dat het in Utrecht overspoelt van de jongeren met borden, dus dat is echt helemaal top. En ja, we hebben er zin in, hè Mare?
Ja.
Oh, die politiek shit boeit me niet, man. Ja, toch? En maar nu lach je nou als die gaat. Die politiek shit boeit me niet.
Politiek zelf is vaag. Ik weet ook nog steeds niet het verschil tussen links en rechts. Dus vaak zijn het ook dingen die dan mij niet zo heel veel interesseren. Zoals hoeveel geld er nou naar de overheid gaat. En zo. Weet je wel, ook naar het leger, dat soort dingen. Soms hoor ik wel van mijn oma of zo, weet je wel. Maar meer hou ik ook niet echt mee bezig.
Politiek meer als iets, als dat je overal wel iets van kan vinden in plaats van dat je jezelf ervoor afsluit. Meer je ogen openen, dat vind ik eigenlijk politiek.
We zijn heel erg grote luxe gewend. En we denken niet echt na over de gevolgen van onze keuzes. En juist heel die disconnectie, doordat we allemaal in hele gefabriceerde steden leven, helemaal los van de natuur. Die hele disconnectie met de natuur is in mijn optiek toch wel de reden dat mensen geen verantwoordelijkheid en geen schuldgevoel voelen.
Ik vind milieu heel belangrijk. Er zijn heel veel signalen dat het er allemaal niet zo goed mee gaat en ook qua de omgeving en dieren en alles. Dus ik heb het idee dat er niet genoeg naar gekeken wordt. En ik denk dat dan net als de Thierry Baudet.
Ik geloof niet dat er een klimaatprobleem is. Ik geloof ook niet dat voor zover het klimaat inderdaad verandert, zoals altijd verandert, de mens daar een hele grote invloed op heeft.
Ja, dan denk ik van steek je nou je hoofd in het zand of hou je je gewoon niet met belangrijke dingen bezig. Want iedereen houdt zich wel bezig met economie en geld, wat uiteindelijk maar een papiertje is. Maar wanneer op een gegeven moment alle bomen weg zijn en zuurstof raakt op, of wie wil ergens gaan wonen, maar elke week is er een modderstroom. Ja, dan ben je toch, waar ben je dan met je geld? Dan kun je een mooi huis bouwen van je geld, of waar ga je er dan mee doen?
Zeg eens, we zijn op het Malieveld!
Ik moest hem van de politie eigenlijk weggooien toen ik terugliep van de klimaatmars. Zei ze, ja maar dit is aanstootgevend voor andere mensen. En ik zo, ik heb echt een positieve tekst op staan, weet je wel. Het is niet alsof erop staat, fuck Rutte, weet je wel. Dat staat er niet op, er is echt niks aan de hand. Het was van, ja dat mag niet. En ik dacht, vrijheid van meningsuiting, wat is dit? Toen moest ik hem dubbel houden, maar hij is nu weer recht.
Ik denk dat het enige wat ertoe doet is het werken aan een fijne leefomgeving. Met fijne leefomgeving voor mensen bedoel ik dus gewoon natuur. Dat is waar ik zie dat mensen gelukkig van worden en waar we thuis horen. Mensen moeten dat uit zichzelf willen en ze kunnen het alleen willen als ze de ernst ervan inzien. En dat zien ze er alleen van in als zij een band hebben met de natuur.
Ik denk dat de nadruk iets minder zou moeten liggen op het geld. In principe. Maar ja, dat is denk ik wel ook weer heel lastig om dan een heel systeem en heel landen daarop draaien. Is ook niet zomaar te veranderen.
Ik denk dat een soort van collectief bewustzijn daarin iets is wat nu nagestreefd moet worden. En een zekere mate van verantwoordelijkheid nemen. En dat is iets waar je nu voor zou kunnen inzetten. En ja, dat is ook iets wat ik wil doen met mijn leven.
So that's one of the 10 episodes that we're going to launch from this project on social media. This was actually my presentation. I hope everybody is healthy and safe in these very difficult times. I do hope you will engage with this presentation and ask me questions via Twitter and other social media. I would love to hear your input and get also a little bit of a dialogue in this kind of one-sided presentation. Thanks so much to the Walker team and Emmett for organizing and facilitating this, and thank you so much for watching.